Matt Meiselman here, bringing you an episode of Studying the Sharps, a new DraftKings podcast where we talk to DFS players and bettors about the methods they use to win at DFS and sports betting. For this episode, I talked to Jordan Cooper, who also goes by Blenderhd, and he's a host of shows at Roto Grinders and has an audio masterclass called The Theory of DFS. And we got super detailed about some of the concepts that both of us think about in both DFS and sports betting. We talked about what it takes to construct a winning DFS lineup, what things people should think about, and how it varies from sport to sport. And we also got a little bit into what betting splits mean and how people can use or not use them. It was an interesting conversation, and I hope you all enjoy it. Okay, so the first thing, I don't actually know if we should include this or not, but whatever. I'll just ask you, does anyone call you Jordan anymore, or are you just Blender to everyone in the world?
I mean, obviously the DFS people may call me Blender. It's more of a misunderstanding of my username than anything else.
Right. What is the username? Like, what does it actually mean?
Blenderhd. Like, it's a Bad Religion song. So like I was always in the punk hardcore scene. So when I started doing my own digital marketing business, you obviously have to set up like an LLC or something like that. And I didn't want it to be Jordan Cooper Media or something. Right. So I'm like, I'll do the punk thing of like, my favorite band's Bad Religion. Let me find a song of theirs. And it's not my favorite song of theirs, but it's like, oh, Blenderhd Media. It's like, okay, that sounds pretty good. Put it on a business card. And then you go to Twitter and someone has the username Blenderhd. And it's like, okay. I really didn't think about that. So I'm like, well, Blender_head. No, that's taken. Right. And then Blenderhd_. I'm not a big fan of that. So I'm like, let me just take the E and the A and just Blenderhd HD. Right. So people are like, oh, it's like Blender high definition, whatever. And then they condense it down to Blender. In DFS, it doesn't matter. As long as I'm on top of the leaderboard, you can call me whatever you want.
That is a fair point. Yeah, for sure. So if everyone wants to say Blenderhd won our contest today and how do we beat this guy, that works for you. Okay, so the place I kind of want to start is just the psychology of people playing DFS. And we'll get into sports betting stuff too, but obviously you specialize in DFS. So my question has been, how do you think the average person is thinking, and specifically GPPs, right? Because I know that's what you focus on, and most people are playing GPPs, not cash games. But how is the average person thinking about putting their lineup together? Like, my interpretation is that people are trying to do two things at the same time. They're trying to have fun, and they're also trying to win first place. And because they're trying to do both of them, they can't do both of them. Like, it's not as fun because they're not winning, and they can't win because their lineups are too safe. So do you think about it in the same way? Like, it's just conflicting goals more or less?
No, I think what happens is that average DFS players, casual people, and even when I say casual, you could still be playing DFS every day for $5, you throw it in. You don't have to be, making tons of lineups or playing for thousands of dollars. Is that I would say 98% of people are playing one game, while me and another 2% of people are playing a different game. It looks the same, but the mechanics of the game are different. So 98% of people are trying to pick the players that are going to do the best on a given day. For a Sunday NFL slate, they go, who do I think is going to do well? And I'm obviously limited by salary and positions, and try to put together 9 players that they think will do well. Like, they're trying to predict the exact outcome of the game. While the 2% of people that are playing are trying to figure out what type of lineup, based on the probabilities of all of these outcomes, has a better shot at winning first place, where most of the equity in these contests are. And it's not I don't really care what happens on Sunday. I'd rather know that so-and-so has a 64% chance at this score, a 30% chance at that score. Like, I'm not trying to predict what is actually going to happen. I just need to get the probabilities around the same. And then based on those probabilities, well, what type of lineup combined with all those probabilities is more likely to win first place based on what the field is thinking those probabilities are. Most 98% of the field, those casual players, are, oh, I think this guy's going to do well. It's like, well, then they may end up being over-owned for their actual probability. So to me, I think that's the fundamental difference between playing DFS, I guess, like you said, for fun. I find it fun, the puzzle solving.
Winning is still fun. So yeah, that thing I don't really get. But I've listened to you talk about this concept a lot that you just outlined, and I feel like I generally agree with the premise, but I think it's murkier than what you're describing. So like, I don't think every winning player thinks about DFS the way you do. I think most of them probably do, but there are probably others who I'm sure you could name who are winning just because their projections are better. And even though it's a GPP, their projections are so much better that even though they don't think that much about ownership, they're still coming out ahead. We could argue whether it's sustainable or not, right?
Right, but even then, Matt, the projections, they're not viewing the projection as purely a median or a mean of a range of outcomes. Right. They're considering the entire range of outcomes. So like, you could have the best projections in the world and just use the 50th percentiles of those. All that's really going to do is end up, a lot of people are good at identifying, like, based on salary, like the quote best plays. Like you don't even need projections for that. I could look at a slate and just based on past data, based on what you've seen them play, go, well, if Christian McCaffrey is $4,000 on the slate, like I'm obviously going to play him because he should be 9,500. Like that's what most of the public believes DFS is, of, oh, this guy's underpriced based on what I think he's going to do tomorrow. But projection wise, the good players aren't just taking like, well, who's the most inefficient players and then just putting them in one lineup, because for a progressively payout structure GPP, it's more of a mix of high probable players with low probable players that have high ceilings. That combination combined, obviously, with the ownership, they naturally, if they have a different projection model, if they have a different way of going about it, the top plays, the quote, top plays are probably still going to be the top plays. Yeah. But those secondary pieces may be slightly
agree.
Different.
I agree. Yeah. So it's like if you were using ceiling projections instead of mean projections, and maybe your model is really good at accounting for the 90th percentile or 95th percentile or whatever, you're going to be naturally a little more contrarian just because like that's a different thing than most people are doing. So you're getting there a different way. So I do think that that's two separate categories amongst good players, but they are kind of similar. But it's more in the average player where I think you could divide what you're saying is like most people are playing the game wrong, where I think that the divide is that some people are trying to win, but doing it wrong because they're trying to use the most underpriced value, quote unquote value plays in their lineups. But I don't think that that's what all of them are doing. It might not even be what most of them are doing. I think the typical average player is trying to optimize for two different things at once. They're trying to be good, but they're also trying to not lose right away. So I know you've talked about this, right? Like you want to, their goal may be just to stay in the slate for as many hours as possible to maximize entertainment, with a bit of delusion as to like how good that actually is to do. So that's where I think it comes down to, right? Is like a lot of these people are playing DFS to get close. And if they get close, they think that means that they actually had a shot, but they never really had a shot, right? Like you've given the example, like you come in 75th place all the time, but there was no way for you to get up to fifth place or even first place because all the players you have are owned in lineups ahead of you, and you just can't get to that combination that actually wins. But I don't think those people are trying to win primarily. They've kind of got this like multi-layered idea of what DFS is even for.
Well, I think the main problem is thinking in raw money rather than in expected returns. Like that, I think that's a better way of putting it. So, for instance, we have these showdown contests. I think it's a good way to describe it. That the player pool is limited. The prize pools, especially in NFL, are just insane, and it's not that hard to put together a good lineup because there's only so many choices. If you want to maximize your shot at cashing, at getting a 1.5x payout, an average Joe could do that. I think it's not that complicated, even on classic slates or anything. It's just that if we were to play this slate out 1,000 times, 10,000 times, if you continually do this, you will find that while you feel like, oh, well, like 45% of the time I cash. And a couple of those were 3Xs or 4Xs or 5Xs. And they don't realize that after 100 slates, they're losing money to the management fee, to the 15% that DraftKings takes out of the contest.
Right.
That
and they also don't realize
that way without that fee, they'd actually be possibly be slightly profitable. But because of that, like, it's not important long term to come in those 1.5x spots. You need to maximize for much higher than that, but without having that long term view. To me, it's the tunnel vision of the process versus results type of thing, where I'm focused on what can I do to turn $10 into not $0 on this one slate, rather than me, who, when I play showdown contests, like I could probably pull up my results. 200 showdown slates, I probably lost money, I think, on 195 of them. But the 5 that I've won money on were 5-6 figure scores, where like it makes up for all of that, and then I make that in return. So like my results on one given slate doesn't really matter. I'm not aiming for cashing. I'm going into the NFL season knowing I'm going to play 3 showdown slates a week, right? Sunday night, Monday night, Thursday night. And I'm going to play this strategy of aiming for first, knowing that out of 18 weeks times 3 to 48 slates, 50 slates, that if I'm entering X amount of dollars, like I'm entering it as a season. Like I'm at like that.
Yeah.
If I'm playing $1,000 in volume, I'm
I really
50,000.
And then talk about it's this idea that you're not diversifying each day. You're diversifying across a year, right? So like when you talk about your portfolio of lineups, that doesn't mean you have to have all these exposures to all these different players and you play 20 lineups or 150 lineups and you have like a bit of everything so that you make sure you're diversified. Your method for diversification is you just do the best thing each day and you diversify across the year, where you play each asset, quote unquote, is a different day of the season. And like that concept to me, I mean, I think it's a really powerful concept. That's what people should be thinking about, right? Like you don't win if you just play a little bit of every stack. Because you're thinking about exposures, you're not thinking about lineups. I know this is like right into your wheelhouse of exposures versus lineups, but can you just elaborate on that a little more? Like why that's so problematic to just not think about your exposures in terms of days played throughout the season, but instead why it's so problematic to just do this thing where it's like I have 25% of this guy and 25% of this. So if this, no matter what happens, I'll have a shot, right? Like, why is that so problematic?
Well, because you have to look at the expected value of the individual lineups. Like every lineup has, if we could calculate, it's impossible to, because we're trying to predict the future. But if we go back to the day before, so let's say we play out a Sunday NFL slate, and then the next day you go back and now you know all the outcomes. You also know all of the lineups that were in that contest. So you could go back before and go, what combinations can I make of all of these? We already know what the players scored. So you go through and you go, well, if this lineup would have won if it was rostered, but it's not rostered because most people don't have the perfect lineup.
Right.
So if you go down, you could do this before the slate. People use simulations to take their projections, which is a range of outcomes. Like I know that I'm coming around this from the long way. People maybe go, you're not really answering the question. Trust me, I'm answering the question.
I know you're going to get there.
Right. Matt knows I'm going to get there. So if someone has a range of outcomes of 8 points to 30 points, and you know the frequency in which that happens you could simulate the contest. If I knew the lineups that were in the contest, I could then go, okay, let's play this slate out one time. And sometimes that running back gets 10 points. Sometimes it gets 30 points. Sometimes it's 22. So you keep on running these based on the frequencies of their projections. And then you could look at the lineups based on the payout structure. And okay, there were 117,000 lineups in this contest, and you know what they are because you just saw the ownership of them. You're doing this the day after, and then you run and you go, okay, based on my accurate projections, here are the lineups that over 100,000 trials, over 500,000 trials, over 2 million trials shows the highest return. I put in $1 and get out $1.27, right, to my entry fee. I get out, put in $1, I get in $1.15. Now, if you take the top expected value lineups, they'll all have a different standard deviation. So you may actually have some lineups that are profitable that actually never win first place. They made the highest they get is 8th place, but they get in that range often enough that it's still profitable, right? And there are some lineups that most of the time they don't even finish in the money, but out of 200,000 trials, they actually come in the top 5 like 6 or 7 times. And when that happens, it makes all of those trials worth playing. So getting around to the exposures or anything, if you're not thinking in terms of lineups, how do you get to those lineups? That's the point that you're trying to do. Get to those high EV lineups. Now, a lot of that is dependent on ownership. A lot of it is dependent on correlation between the players. So here's a simple example. In NFL, we know that you're probably going to play the quarterback and the wide receiver together, right? Like, because they're correlated to one another. Quarterback throws the ball, wide receiver catches the ball. If you say that I have 25% Ryan Tannehill and I have 25% AJ Brown, like, well, they should both be in the same line. Like, you have 25% of both together, but if you had them separated, like, that wouldn't be optimal. You're not making good lineups. If you're saying I'm going to play the 40% owned Christian McCaffrey and the 40% owned Dalvin Cook, and I have 50% exposure to each. It's like, well, the lineups that have them both together are different than lineups that have none of them together, that are different than lineups that have one of them in. So just knowing your distribution doesn't mean anything, because you could be building lineups. Let's say I build 100 lineups. This comes into problems with some optimizers if you don't know what you're doing, is that I want 50% of these, great plays, right? And then you build 100 lineups and the top 50 have all of those in the same lineup together, and then the bottom 50 have none of them. And then mathematically, it would be correct. You have 50% of that guy and 50% of the other guy, but your top 50 lineups are way too chalky to have really much first place equity or anything. And then your bottom lineups don't have much first place equity because their projection is just so horrible and lack of correlation. So now you've built 100 lineups with the exact exposures that you've had, but the individual EV of each lineup is all negative.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think one of the things that gets people here is they think about stocks and they think about diversifying their assets. And what they're doing is they're equating, let's say, like owning Apple to owning Bitcoin, and they're negatively correlated. So I'm diversified, right? And they think that's the same with having like Patrick Mahomes in one lineup and Clyde Edwards-Helaire in another lineup, and they're negatively correlated so that I'm diversified. But that's a false equivalency. What actually is more accurate is to say that Apple is like a lineup and Bitcoin is another whole lineup. It's not, they're not players. You're now doing negative correlation across the individual components within the asset, which doesn't do anything. Like, you need the whole lineup to diversify against your other whole lineup. So like, we can probably both agree that diversifying your portfolio is a good thing for bankroll management in general, right? Like, it probably lowers your EV slightly, but it also lowers your chance of busting out and running out of money. It lowers that probability too. It's like diversifying, all else being equal, is a good thing to do. But if you're diversifying the wrong thing, then you're not actually getting the benefit you think you're getting. So to play like a lot of Patrick Mahomes and then a lot of Lamar Jackson and a lot of Aaron Rodgers, if you don't actually know what the lineup that they're in is, then you're diversifying pieces of an asset and not the asset, if that makes sense.
Right. If we take a look at like the example I gave before, let's say I'm using the example that we have two running backs that are 50+% owned at 9K, right? Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, whatever. To properly diversify, like the lineup with a high owned running back that's very expensive is more likely to contain a like 3K wide receiver because you only have so much salary, or a punt tight end. So that's how that lineup would look. So if you're going to play a high-owned running back in a construction that looks like that, most likely you shouldn't also be playing the punt wide receiver that's also like the 25% owned punt wide receiver in that lineup. Because now in that lineup with that 50% running back, you're going to play the 5% owned 3K wide receiver. Now in the lineups that don't have that 50% owned running back, then you could play the 3K, the 25% owned 3K wide, because you're going to play Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry's only 5%. So instead of playing McCaffrey in that lineup, you're playing Henry. But the total combination between the two make it diversified, because now you're playing better lineups together. And then now you add another layer and you're like, well, based on this, I could play a quarterback, wide receiver, and a run back, a player from the opposite side of the game. Like, how do those pieces fit in? And maybe if in lineups, let's say like this coming week, we have Minnesota and Cincinnati, and Dalvin Cook, but I'm making up numbers. Let's say he's super uber duper chalk, 50%. The negative correlation to Dalvin Cook is a Cousins, is not a not having him. It's a Cousins Thielen type of lineup. It's a Cousins Jefferson type of lineup where the Vikings still put up 4 or 5 touchdowns, but Dalvin Cook busts. So in your Dalvin Cook lineups, it maybe make more sense to play a Bengal on the other side. You play Burrow and Higgins. So you're capitalizing your whole lineup on a certain outcome. But in other lineups, to diversify, you're taking the negative. You're not taking the fact that the Vikings are not going to win. You're just saying that the production is going to go in a different way. If Dalvin Cook fails, who benefits from that? So those lineups look differently. But if you just think in terms of exposures, you're never going to get that natural diversification. You're going to end. What is going to end up happening is that you have Dalvin Cook, at Vikings and Bengals on the other side in some lineups, and those lineups are all going to look very like, oh, I have 20% of that, but like they're 2v2s. So like right. Your lineups of those are correlated.
Running back with the chalk cheap receiver in half your lineups, and then in your other half, you're getting everyone's contrarian, and you have nothing in the middle, because what you're talking about is a good lineup is the proper amount of leverage. You don't want all the chalk together. It's not that you can't play popular players. It's that you have to have the right balance. And I think it's just like a hard concept for people to grasp. If we're trying to tell someone you can build one lineup for a Sunday, what do?
You can do whatever you want.
You can do it, right. But there are probably, like you've outlined, you could play 1,000 different combinations, probably 10,000 that are actually good lineups to varying degrees, right? But you could play 10,000 different lineups that all are quote unquote good, but there are way more lineups that are bad. So what's the difference between a good and a bad lineup? And the difference seems to be you have to be equating projections and ownership together in some way that has a balance. So I think what may be hard is that people don't understand why being balanced actually helps. They think, it depends on the sport too, right? Like we're coming towards the end of baseball season here. And honestly, like in baseball, which is very different than football and basketball, you don't need any chalk in your lineup. You can have a winning lineup where every player's 0.5% owned, because for the chalk team to fail, like you say, if Dalvin Cook is bad, who benefits? There's a clear answer to that. It's either, the backup running back if he gets hurt, or it's the passing game, or it's the opposing defense. There are different things that benefit if he's bad. In baseball, though, it's like, who benefits if Aaron Judge is bad? It's no one on the Yankees. They actually all are hurt by him being bad. They're all correlated to each other. They need each other to produce RBIs and runs and more at bats and everything. It's really just the opposing pitcher, and that's it, right? No one else benefits. So
right, but Matt, that's the main reason in baseball, for instance. If you want to immediately improve your chances of winning first place in baseball, figure out what stack. Because most likely in GPP, you've learned by now, correlation matters a lot in baseball.
Yeah.
So you're going to play most people are going to play a 5-man or at least a 4-man stack on DraftKings GPPs. And you go like, who's the top owned pitcher? Like if a pitcher is going to be 40% owned, like we'll just play 5 batters against them, because if that pitcher fails, 40% of the lineups fail. Now, The reason why that pitcher is 40+% owned is because he projects as the best pitcher on the slate. I mean, typically he is the best pitcher on the slate. He's more likely to succeed, but your path to first place is easier if he fails. Now, does that mean you have to stack against him? No. But if you think in terms of if all the chalk gets there, it's very hard to win first place no matter what, because everyone has the same points.
Yeah.
It's going to be the difference of
a
very
much
small.
higher score to win, which is what people don't think about. If all the chalk is good, the winning score will be through the roof. And you get these people who are like, oh, I scored 185 points tonight and I finished in 457th place. What happened?
Right. That's someone that played a lineup with not enough balance of ownership and projection. The key is that I'm aiming. Most good players aim to win the low scoring slates.
Yeah.
When the chalk fails. But the thing is, people get too focused in on, Matt, on these terms. People say, what's the good chalk and the bad chalk? And I say, those are descriptive terms. You don't know. All projections are a range of outcomes. So if we have, let's say, 50% owned running backs, I know we're heading into NFL season, so I'm talking about NFL. And someone would ask me, I could only play 2 of them, right? And you go, which one is the bad chalk out of those 50%? I go, well, if they're all about equal, they're all fail at about an equal percent. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but more likely than not, if all 3 of them do well, it's going to be very hard to win because everyone's going to have the same points. Like like you said, everyone's going to be scoring 250 points. So you're hoping for one of them to fail. Right? If one of them fail, now this top score starts going down. If 2 out of the 3 fail, it goes even lower. If all 3 fail, it gets to the lowest. But it doesn't mean that you have to say, well, I'm going to act as if all 3 fail. I mean, you could just understand that that's going to be highly variant. You're going to lose way more often, but when you win, you're going to win everything. But if you want a balance of that and say, I'm going to play one, the chances are 1 out of these 50% owned high, ceiling running backs is going to put up a good score.
Right. But here's
the key, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, the key is based on the projections. I don't know which one. Like, I'm not trying to figure out which one. All I know is that my lineup could only have one of them. So if I had exposures, quote unquote, I said, I want to diversify. I'm going to play 33% of one, 33% of another, and 33% of the other one. The thing is, I'm not going to have any of them in the same lineups together. So right, I'm now my exposures are good.
Right. The key is not playing them together or not pairing them with other popular things. But I do think there's actually an answer to like the good chalk versus bad chalk question. Maybe it has to be framed a little differently than you're thinking about it. I actually don't think we've talked about DFS a bunch in the past. I don't think I've ever told you about the way that I put together, trying to figure out this problem of like which high owned players are worth it. Let's say you had to make one lineup, right? Someone gave you a free ticket into a $1,500 tournament and you had to make just one single entry lineup. Which of the popular running backs do you play? So basically the methodology I have now is aggregate the ownership projections, aggregate some other projection source, plug in the salaries, of course, and then figure out in each category how many standard deviations above or below the mean for that position the player is. So I basically have like a weighting system where the running back is projected for 23 points. The average running back is 13. So he's like this above. And then the average running back ownership is 18%. And this guy's 31. So he's actually this below because more ownership is worse. And then point per dollar, he's like 1.8 points per dollar. The average running back is like 1.7. So he's like right around the middle. And then it cumulatively puts those 3 numbers together to create one rating. And that's basically my process for trying to figure out if a player is too owned or not, just in a vacuum, right? Like not
right. But Matt, what you're describing exactly what I do. Exactly what I do. The proper way to term instead of good chalk and bad chalk is over owned or under owned.
Right.
For their success.
But different depending on the rest of your lineup. But
right.
In a vacuum, you can actually make these claims. Like you can say, it's not that you want to play 0% of Marquez Callaway as the chalk punt receiver in week 1, but you can say objectively his ownership is too high for what he is.
Right. His ownership is too high for what he is, but his raw score may still be worth it. And when he hits his 80th percentile outcome, that from an exposure perspective, so we're talking about exposures versus lineups. So for instance, you're bringing up Callaway, who's probably going to be 30+% owned on the slate that's coming up. Am I likely? He's overowned. Like I mean, I don't even have to look at anything. I know on a 13-game slate, the 3,400, he's overowned. How much is he overowned? That's semantics. We're not going to get into how much he's overowned. But if I believe that he's heavily overowned, that means I'm most likely, if he's going to be 30% owned and I'm playing 150 lineups, he may end up in 10% of them, right? He may, depending on how overowned or underowned he is. But in the lineups that he's in lineups with game stacks that no one's playing. I mean, like he's in the most he's going to be in the most contrarian lineups. So from an exposure perspective, most people will use a lineup builder or an optimizer, or they're hand building and they're doing it by tally. That's what I used to do back in 2016 and 17.
Which we should get to, by the way, because I think hand building, as you've talked about it, you continue from here, but like that's the way you figure this out.
Right. So you go through and you go, I'm going to let's say you're going to play 10 lineups and go, well, do it. I think Marquez Callaway is overowned, so I don't want to invest as much of my portfolio into him because he doesn't benefit me from an EV perspective enough. But there could be lineups that he could be fine in. So when people say that, you know, like because one of the things that average players do is they go, well, I'm just going to figure out who the top 5 chalky players and not play any of them. It's like, well, they're chalk because they have a high point per dollar bet. Like, raw points wise, you still need to get enough raw points. So if you find players that are what I would call negative leverage, right? Negative EV, they're overowned. Marquez Callaway. All that's doing is telling you that you need to make up how overowned they are with the relative amount of underowned players. So if someone is highly overowned, let's say in this instance, we believe, if we put it to a number, that Marquez Callaway should only be 15% owned, but he's going to be 30. So that's like double the amount.
Yeah.
Let's say you find a player that is going to be 5% owned, right? But should be 15% owned. Like that's a healthy gap in between.
Right.
Well,
in
now
circumstance,
player
0 Callaway, and I'm just playing only the other guy.
Or you're playing a lineup with both of them combined together because one guy's ownership makes up for the increased ownership of the other guy. So that's what I mean by you're making lineups. So when you talk the average player from the very beginning, like 98% of people, what are the best plays? How could I put them together? And should I play this guy or that guy? Should I play 2B2?
Yeah, it's how can I like the way my lineup looks the most, where I feel great. I mean, you've probably said this before, but like if you feel good about your lineup for those reasons, because everyone is, you know, cost efficient going into your lineup, it's not a good lineup because everyone has it. So
well, not for GP, obviously for double ups and 50,
that's what you want.
That's fine.
In cash games, that's the way to do it. But I feel like there's another nuance here that is much harder in football and basketball, which actually I think is much easier in baseball. So like in baseball, if you have a 15-game slate, any hitter over 25% owned is essentially bad. Like unless he's Mike Trout and he costs 2K or something, like for the most part, you don't need to play anyone that's that owned. And you could probably argue even in that scenario, right? Like if he's that owned on that big of a slate, even if he costs the minimum, you still don't need to play him. But whatever, let's just take normal priced players that are 25% owned on a full slate. You can fade all of them because they don't negatively correlate with each other. There's a scenario where they're all bad. But I think basketball actually outlines this point a little better than football does. But let's say you have a game where the 2 best players on a team are ruled out. And now you have the whole bench is in an enhanced role. Like all these guys are way underpriced for what they're doing because someone has to score points on the basketball team. And football is kind of true in this instance, but basketball, right? Like any team is going to score at least 80 real points in just about any game that ever happens because someone has to score. You can't just say they're all over-owned, I'm playing no one, even if it's true that they're all over-owned. You still have to build a lineup that uses like at least one of those guys because someone has to score. And if you, well, I'll just make the example more concrete. If LeBron and Davis are ruled out, right? Like you can fade this year, it'll be Westbrook. You can fade Westbrook, but like if you fade him and then don't play anyone else on the team, you're not winning first place because all of those bench players cost the minimum and one of them is going to score 40 fantasy points at high ownership. So you get what I'm saying there, right? Like you have to factor in the fact that someone has to do well based on the sport.
Well, it comes to the fact of how the sports scoring is and how correlative it is to opportunities. Okay, so you use the baseball example. Mike Trout at 2000 is going to get 4, maybe 5 at bats, right? Almost everyone on the slate. Obviously, there's some pinch hitters or something. You know, someone gets pinched in a platoon split or something. But most hitters on the slate are going to see 3 to 5 at bats, and those are the only chances they have to make points, right? So no matter what the price is, like a guy with 3 at bats could outscore a guy with 5 at bats easily. I mean, no one's going to get 12 at bats. I mean, obviously, it could be, yeah, sure, a 700 inning game or something. Yeah, it could go on forever. But in football, you get more opportunities than in baseball. So if a team is going to rush the ball 30 times, yeah, maybe their starting running back isn't the one that gets all 30, but they're going to have 20 opportunities to get points, right? So if you take away this, like in football, if you took away the starting running back, who's 9,000, who's going to get 25 touches and 5 targets, and then you say his replacement is also going to get 25 opportunities, 30 total opportunities to score points. Well, opportunity matters, like in football, right? Because if a 4-yard run still gets you points. In baseball, you get 3 to 5 opportunities. If you strike out, you get 0. It's very hard to get more. Like, that's not iterative scoring. In basketball, it's the most. There's no events in basketball. How much can you get on one individual basketball play? A rebound, steal, 3-pointer, maybe
or
together.
It's more stable across the game. It's
right. So if you're telling me that in baseball, the most you could probably get is 5 opportunities. Oh, this guy is not in the lineup, and now his replacement is 2K and batting leadoff. Doesn't make him a bad play, probably good from a median perspective, but he's still only going to see like 4 or 5 at bat. He's not getting any more opportunities, no matter what the price difference is. But in basketball, you get an $11,000 player. Giannis is out, and you know that a 4K player will come in that normally would play 10 minutes, and he's now going to play 36 minutes. Mm-hmm. Like, there's only 5 guys on a basketball court. Like, he's instead of getting, he was priced as if he was going to get a total amount of about 8 to 10 interactions. Now he's going to be getting like 70 to 80 interactions. And it's much easier to score points in basketball than it is to baseball or even football. That, like, most likely that type of player, I mean, he may be in almost every one of my lineups because his failure rate is so low. And even though a lot of people say, oh, how do I fade? The guy's going to be 87% owned. Like, that's what he's way over owned. And a lot of times I'll say, nope, he's actually under owned. Right. Well, his success rate is actually 96%. So he's actually under owned.
So because it's very hard. What I'm talking about is you have 3 of those on the same team, right? So, like, in that case, sure, you can play all of them, because if they're all 4K with 40 minutes, you can just play all of them, because they're all, maybe they're not all under owned, but if you have an otherwise fairly contrarian lineup, like, they're all fine. You're not going to lose because of them, and most likely you're going to have needed them. But what I'm talking about more is, like, you have 3 of the guys that are in the 6 to 8K range, let's say, where they're priced in the middle, and most likely 2 of them will be great, at least, because they're all getting additional opportunities. So it's not like the most extreme example where you have the flat minimum guy playing the entire game. That one's easier. It's more like the guy who's underpriced, and then the other guy on his team is underpriced, and then the other guy on his team is underpriced, and they're all chalk. And it's like, to me, if you ask me what is the thing that most people do wrong in those 2 sports, basketball and football, it's either they play none of the negatively correlated chalk, or they play all of it, right? Like, right. I'm sure you have your own answer. Maybe you agree.
This is the same thing. Isn't this what I explained before with the 3 running backs?
Yeah.
Right. It's like, here's 3 guys. Most likely 2 out of the 3 succeed and 1 fails.
But there's a difference, though. Those players are not correlated to each other.
Right. But it's the same. But Matt, it's the same instance on a basketball court. Each of those players, if there are 3 players on the same team at 4K, players on a basketball court are from a ceiling perspective, are negatively correlated to each other.
Yeah.
Because you'd rather have, if you're going to roster 1 out of those 3, you'd rather that one guy put up basically 70 points and the
Right.
other 2 fail. But it's most likely that 2 of them will put up a GPP winning score, and one of them will kind of be
He'll be fine, but not
score that you
great.
may not even have. But it's unlikely. It's actually unlikely. The most unlikely scenario in that case is all 3 of them to fail or all 3 of them to hit a GPP ceiling. Like those are the 2 unlikeliest cases. And like you said, a lot of average players, they go for those instead of just saying, I don't know which 2 out of the 3 or 1 out of the 3 I'm going to play. So I'm just going to, even if it's one lineup, fine, flip a coin. It doesn't matter if they're about equal. Just build a lineup with 2 of them in it. Pick the 2 that you want. That's going to be much better than one that has either 0 or all 3 in it.
No, for sure. I think that this particular area, like you have to realize essentially what it boils down to is you have to realize how interrelated your picks are. Like you have to, I don't even think it requires much math. You just have to think about it conceptually, just how much relation between the players on the team is there. In baseball, you can say everything's positively correlated. It's not really like you can't even think of negative correlation from a baseball team. But in other sports, like it gets more nuanced, right? Where like the quarterback plus the receiver are positively correlated. The quarterback with 2 receivers, they may all be positively correlated because if the game flow is such that they get more opportunities, they all benefit. But then you add on a 3rd receiver from the same team, and now you're getting diminishing returns on the correlation. And then you add on a 4th, and now you're going straight downhill because there's just no way 4 receivers on the same team can all do well. So like thinking about where that midpoint, where that cutoff point is, seems to me to be the thing where it's like, how much of this situation is the optimal amount of the situation to have?
Right. And it also is dependent on price.
Yeah.
So like we've had in the past, now it's Brady, but it used to be Jameis Winston on the Buccaneers. We'd have Evans and Godwin. And I'd constantly tell people that I can't double stack the Buccaneers ever. It's like, I'm going to choose one or the other, but I'm not going to play Godwin and Evans together. And people will show, it's like, well, they could all do well. It's like, yeah, but I mean, both these receivers are $7,500. Like, what's well enough ceiling wise? Remember, we're aiming for ceiling. So I'm looking for 30 plus points out of a receiver. It's like, so you're telling me the Buccaneers are putting up 60 points today? If they are, okay, I could get 102 touchdowns out of both $7,500 receivers. But if you're going to double stack that scenario, why don't the second guy be the 3K tight end? Because I don't need a big game. How much of a game do I need out of a 3K player as part of the stack? 50 yards and a touchdown. Give me 12 points out of a 3K player. He's still correlated with the quarterback, but now my expense for everything is so much lower. So many people try to, they stack the Chiefs. And
that was going to be my example. Yeah. Like, can you play Hill and Kelsey? Because if they're in a great matchup, they're probably just both chalk anyway. And then you don't want to do it. If they're in a medium matchup where they're both contrarian plays, Mahomes and Hill and Kelsey, they're all low owned, you still may not want to play them all in the same lineup because, right, like you need, if you're going to play the most expensive tight end and the most expensive receiver, if you're going to win even a smaller field tournament, you probably need them both to score 30 fantasy points. And how often does that happen?
It'll happen sometimes, but also the problem with that is that you're spending so much on that correlation that the rest of your line, what does the rest of your lineup look like? To me, that's the first question that I'll ask. Is like, okay, that's fine. And if they put up 50 plus points, that's going to be worthwhile. But what do you have to give up in the rest of your lineup? I mean, you're sitting there with
if there's 7 min price running backs,
it's not going to matter.
Yeah, if there's 7 min price running backs on the slate, and for some reason Hill and Kelsey are still low owned, then sure, that's probably a great stack. But that's
the point that I'm making is the 2 ways people that approach how to build a lineup. I don't want to call it the sharper players, the good players, start from the lineup and then find the players that fit that condition. While average players, casual players, start with the players and go, I want to play like what they'll do is they'll put together like who their best plays are in their head. Even if they're considering ownership, even if it's not just who they think is going to do well. Go, okay, I've identified 30 people I want to play, right? Okay, how do I fit these guys into a lineup, right? That's coming from one side. While I'm coming from the side of what do winning lineups look like? And how do I fit? I don't care who the players are. As winning lineups in NFL GPPs, right? You know, or let's use baseball. Baseball's even easier because it's so correlative. Like, even more often than they're owned, a 5-3 stack type of lineup on a large slate is going to show the highest expected value. So you're taking 5 batters from one team, 3 batters from another team, and obviously the 2 pitchers that aren't against, obviously, those hitters. I'm starting from that, and then I know that based on this ownership, based on how the field is going to play, that even if people sometimes use a blunt determination, which is ownership sum, which is not perfect. I'm not saying that, you know, from a technical perspective, it's not the most accurate way to go, but at least it's directionally accurate, especially for people that may not have fancy models and formulas or whatever. And you go, I'm going to add up all the ownership of all the players in the lineup and then put together the chalkiest lineup you can, the 2 chalk stacks and the 2 chalk pitchers, which whatever batters you want. Add up those ownerships. And maybe that in baseball, it comes out to 160. And you go, okay, you know that's too chalky. So 160 total is too much. So maybe you go, well, if I take out this guy and take out this guy, like, what do I get down to? And it's like, okay, now you get down to like 100. So you're like, okay, can I find lineups that have 100% ownership sum that have 5-3 in the lineup that also project well? I mean, you're probably not playing the chalky stack that, you know, with the 6.5 total in cores or whatever. But now I'm going out. It's now, since I know I need to play a 5-3, I need to play a lineup around 100% ownership sum. All I have to do is look. What stack am I playing? Well, I could play Minnesota. I could play the Twins with the Dodgers, but I could also play the Yankees with the Blue Jays, but I need the bottom of the order for that. Or I'll play the 5-man chalk stack, but I need to play the 2% owned pitcher because now the projection's fine, but now the ownership comes down. So you could see the difference between average players. They're starting with the players. They're starting from, they've already limited themselves. And even if they went to the second level of, I need to find the lineup with 100% ownership sum, maybe the 30 players that they selected doesn't even get them there, right? They're either, well, then I'm not going to play these 2 guys. And then, okay, now your ownership sum is 55 and your projection's too low. And then you're like, well, I'm going to play the puzzle pieces don't fit together. So now they start trying to jam these things together, and they're not building good lineups because they're not starting from that baseline of what should a winning high equity plus EV GPP lineup look like.
Right. I actually see this a lot even with people who build by hand, where they say, I want to play this stack and I want to play this pitcher. My second pitcher is fine. Like, I'll pick someone else if it doesn't fit right. And they start putting it together. It's too expensive. And they're like, well, I'll just throw a 2K shortstop in there to make it all work. It's like, you're missing the point that you're trying to build a good lineup, not trying to make this stack fit with the pitcher that you like. Because I think it also comes down to a lot of cognitive dissonance where people, they probably read and absorb a lot of content throughout the day, and then they get it in their head, they want to play this, right? Like, there's 4 or 5 players they want to have, like you said. And then if they don't end up playing those players, and then that thing would have won them money, that's the end of the world, right? Like, the worst is if you were on a play all day long and then you pivot because, let's say, like, your sense of the ownership changed and it seemed like too many people were going to have it, and then you switch. And even worse, maybe it wasn't actually as popular as you thought it'd be, right? Like, you pivoted for no reason, and then that thing ended up winning and you had someone else, and now you could have won thousands of dollars, but you ended up losing money. Like, that emotional state that people find themselves in when that kind of thing happens, it almost seems like they're trying to avoid that more than they're actually trying to build the best lineup. So I feel like self-awareness has to be the biggest part. Like, just have self-awareness. You're doing that. And maybe you ultimately, like, that is your goal, right? Like, you just want to avoid having the emotional downswing. So you just play for that and you realize that, like, the money won't come with it. But I feel like I'm just trying to preach the self-awareness.
Right. Well, you have to take the emotion out of the game. I mean, I play poker for a living. You know how many 1-outers I've been hit against me or whatever? Like, all I could look at is my decisions. And I go, if I were to make this decision 1,000 times, do I show up with money at the end of it all and profit? Yes. So, like, what am I supposed to, what else am I supposed to do? But I mean, I'm used to doing that because I've been playing games.
Like, it's not easy though. I'm sure like when you first started playing games, it didn't come naturally.
No, I'm not basically emotionally available to anyone anyway.
So like, it was always easy for you.
Only because I'm looking at what's the best decision. I've no problem losing playing well. I have a problem losing not playing well.
Did you start out as a big sports fan, or did you avoid that to a significant extent? Because I feel like the fandom is what brings the emotion.
Well, even when I was a sports fan, like the main thing is that like I stopped watching sports in 2003, only watching soccer. And then now that I expanded from DFS soccer into other sports, like I watch all the other sports. But when I was a kid, I was in New York. I was a Rangers fan, Knicks fan, Yankee fan, Giants fan. But I was more of a fan of like Bill James's books, and like I read the backs of the baseball cards. So like I cared about like when I'm 8 years old, I'm taking my baseball cards and trying to put together batting orders, like all-star batting orders, and go, well, the leadoff hitter is going to get on base, and then the guy on second, because this is 1980s type of baseball. You know, it wasn't all just three outcomes.
Him from second to third out of the 6 hole or something like that.
Right, exactly. I found that entertaining. I found the micro baseball game on the Commodore 64 where it's like, oh, I should I steal on a 2-1 pitch? Like, to me, that was the fun part. Those are the decisions I cared about.
Right.
That yes, I root for the team.
That way. Yeah. No, I totally get it. Like when my baseball card, I guess it was MLB Showdown. It was the like playing trading card. I don't know if you ever played that. It was about 20 years ago. But yeah, I would try to construct the lineup where like there'd be the righty lefty split, and then like the slap hitter followed by the power hitter. And I wasn't really thinking like, this is my favorite guy, I have to hit him first. So I think we do relate in that way. But unfortunately, I think most people don't have that naturally. And it's not that they have to, it's just that if you're playing DFS and your goal is to win money, you have to at least bring some of that in. You can't have zero of that stuff.
Yeah, but it depends on what you're playing for. I mean,
right. If your goal is to win, is what I'm saying.
Right. Just like in poker, where you're making money off of other people's entertainment. So if you're playing for entertainment, that's perfectly fine. When I used to play in private games in New York City, or even in casinos or whatever, you have to realize that I'm there to make money, because this is how I'm paying my bills. Doesn't mean I can't have a good time. Doesn't mean I can't eat some food, chalk it up. Tony, what's going on? You know, that type of thing. But most of the people at the table are treating it as a social endeavor. They think they want to win, but really they're gambling, right? It's gambling is an entertainment activity. You go to the roulette table, it's negative expectation, but you're there for the entertainment value. So if you're playing for entertainment value, feel free to do whatever the hell you want. I mean, to me, it doesn't matter. I'm making the money off of those people. I mean, I'm there, right? Of course, in DFS, you can't see me. I'm just a username and a little avatar. But at the poker table, like, I never just sat there with my headphones and sunglasses and never talked to anyone, because I'm aware that if this game was not entertaining, these people would get up. So I'm going to talk to people. I'm going to and also it makes it more entertaining for me. It makes 12-hour sessions go by much easier, folding, 90% of your hands when you're actually engaged in some type of banter or whatever. But the DFS version of that is, watching Red Zone on Sunday. If you want to, I'm gonna take my favorite players. I'm gonna build a couple of lineups, and then even though me and Matt know that you have virtually no shot at winning $1 million, but you like the lottery ticket version of it. Yeah. Like, I have no problem with that, but then you have to, at least, I think the self-awareness is, you have to admit that you are playing a lottery ticket, and you could get lucky. You could make bad decisions and be the millionaire maker winner. It could. It's just like winning the Powerball or something like that. But if you're going to play as a profitable player long term, just like in poker, you're gonna have to learn how to fold some hands. But if you like coming down to the poker room and playing every hand, you could get lucky on some occasions. But understand, at the end of the year, you're probably going to be down. So just separating that, like, if people, because people will come to me, Matt, right, and say, "Oh, the way that you're explaining how to play is not fun," and I go, "Well, is it supposed to be fun? I happen to find what I do to be fun. If you don't find what I do to be fun, and you're like, well, I don't want to do what you're doing, even though it's going to make me more money in the long term, like that, I mean, it would, the DFS as a way for me to make money wouldn't exist without those people. So like,
Yeah,
like,
you can get
what am I
both
supposed to
like you're
say?
doing
Like,
though.
just
You
what
you
you want.
can get the best of both worlds, like what you do in the poker room or DFS. It's like you have on the one side you have the guy wearing the headset and the sunglasses and doesn't speak to anybody. On the other side, you have someone just bleeding money, but they're having the best time and they're getting free drinks and whatever. And to them, it actually, to both of those people, it's plus EV because the EV is not just monetary, right? One person, it's plus EV monetarily because they're just winning, but they're not having any fun. They just don't care about fun. And then the other person is having so much fun that it's actually worth it. They're paying for that entertainment, but you can be in the middle and actually win in a way that's fun. Or just, I mean, the honest answer is that once you start winning, you realize how fun winning is. And then that supersedes, because yeah, no one's saying don't watch Red Zone. Like that's a great activity for anybody, whether you have money invested or not. But yeah, I mean, if you make the right plays and it actually works, it automatically becomes fun.
Make the right lineups, Matt.
Sorry. Yes, of course, of course, of course.
No, but I mean, a lot of average players, a lot of casual players don't realize that I would say a majority, more than half of the best DFS players on DraftKings, when the slate locks, they ain't watching the games. Like they literally just not watching the game. There's some that literally don't watch the sport at all. I mean, they not even to see what's yeah. Go through an entire baseball season without seeing a single pitch.
I'm not one of them, but I know they're out there.
Right. Now, I'm not to that extent. Like I don't watch games to study them for some type of research purpose. It's entertaining to me to sweat the game. I mean, to me, I still have fun doing that. I still have fun watching Red Zone and rooting for my players. Of course, I have like all the players, so I'm just rooting for lineups in the contests. And when baseball locks, like I don't know, probably put up MLB TV. I have 8 games on at the same time. I have a twin stack. That game's starting over there. I mean, but to me, that's not the reason that I play. That's just, what else am I doing? To really more of the fact of either I do this or I watch something on Netflix or I'm watching like, it's still night and I'm still,
so like there's a
nothing.
compulsion there too, right? Like, your lineups are happening, so it's fun to see them. So that's definitely part of it, at least for me. There's honestly, there's probably like 18 more DFS topics that I could ask you about now that are all like probably even related to what we already talked about. I want to ask you about a sports betting thing though, that I've heard you talk about recently that I'm just kind of curious about. So there's a lot of publicity now about the splits, like betting splits and betting handle stuff that comes out. I know you're going to love this. So I think that I mostly agree with what you talk about here. And I get that this is like a weird thing for me as like part of DraftKings to ask you it, but I do like, I know that that's a problematic thing just because of the framing of it, right? And the interpretation, people see it and they use it in a way that maybe it's not intended for. But I actually started out as a sports bettor looking at the line movement before I knew anything about the games. Like that was actually independent of working for DraftKings. This is probably 6-7 years ago. My process used to almost entirely consist of trying to figure out where the sharp money was and following it. And
that's called steam chasing.
It can be. It can be. It doesn't, because you can get ahead of it too, right? So like, basically,
but it's hey, Matt, it's still steam chasing.
Well, you're chasing it.
I'm not saying that they're in a derogatory way either. I'm just saying that there are sports bettors that's their goal.
But wouldn't you agree that like if all of the tickets are on one side and all the money's on the other side, that's at least loosely an indicator, right? So it doesn't mean the bet is good. You probably need some other second, third, fourth piece of information. But my assumption has been that's at least one of several potential indicators that something is there. And you can also use intuition here, right? Like if all the tickets are on the Dodgers and the money is on the Pirates, you can intuitively,
yeah, but you still didn't give me a very important piece of information, Matt.
Yeah.
You didn't give me the numbers.
No, before you get there, because the numbers obviously matter, but let's say every sports book in the world has the same line. It's minus 200.
No, but you no. Hold on, Matt.
The specific numbers you're talking of the bets.
Of the bets, yes.
Okay.
I need like there's it will make it more useful. I'm not even saying that that's useful either, but if you tell me 80%, like for instance, we'll take an NFL game, for instance. Make up the teams. It's the Chiefs and the Bills, and the Chiefs open as a 3-point favorite. Okay. And then you tell me on Sunday morning, when the line is now Chiefs -6, and you go, 80% of the money is on the Chiefs, and 20% is like, well, 80% of the money was probably on the Chiefs at -3, but at -6 now, the sharp money would actually be on the other side of the game.
So in my hypothetical example, I think, yes, what you're saying is a very important point, because when the line moves, it creates more ambiguity in when did the bets happen. But if you take the hypothetical of the line didn't move at any point, it was just minus 200 plus 180 across the board.
If the line didn't move at any point, then it's efficient. And what does it matter?
Not necessarily though, because if most of the bets are on one side and the handle is on the other, the reason for the line not to move is because if the line then moved more towards the favorite where more of the tickets are, there would be more exposure to the larger handle because the handle's on the other side. So it's basically like the house is almost implicitly betting against the public in that scenario. That was the way I always.
There's no such thing as the public. There's no such thing.
The majority. I'll call it the majority.
Matt. Okay, I'm going to go down. Let's say that this was possible. I know there are limits.
Yeah.
Joe Schmo, I go down to DK Sportsbook and I'm going to place $50 million on this side. What does that matter? Tell me. So I'm giving you the exaggerated example.
That's the exaggerated example, and that's why there are flaws in what I'm saying. That's why it's not a perfect model for anything. It's just loosely an indicator, right? Because you would want to know the distribution. If like all the handles on one side, did someone bet $4 million, or did a bunch of people bet $80,000 who are all professional sports bettors? Like,
but you don't know that. But the problem is you don't know that, and you also don't know what the efficient line is, and you don't know what the traders are actually doing. So for instance, let's say it was useful. Okay. Well, we're going by exaggerated examples.
Of course. Okay.
So let's say I am known as the sharpest bettor in the world, right? Everyone knows that if I'm making a bet, it's a 100% guarantee, right? I'm the best, whatever. And I'm going to walk in and let's say they would never allow me to place a $50 million bet. So I go, it's Chiefs -3, right? And I go in and I put $50 million down, right? You know what the line's going to be right after my bet? It's going to be Chiefs -7. I mean, it's going to move dramatically,
right,
to get on the other side of the line. Now, once I place the $50 million bet, and everyone identifies, oh my God, Jordan bet. Oh, that's the sharp side. No, that's the sharp number. First off, it's not the sharp side.
It's the sharp side. There's an important distinction. It's the sharp side at that number.
Right. But I've given the signal to the world. Chiefs -3. If you could get Chiefs -3, the sharpest bettor in the world is on it. And then you go to your phone and you go and bet on the Chiefs, and it's Chiefs -5. No one could get the number I just did, right, because obviously everything's going to move. So those splits that you have, how are you ever going to get that sharp number? They wouldn't exist, right? Even if you knew who the bets were, you would never be able to get that number anyway because it would have moved by the time that you even knew that.
Because of limits, though, we know for the most part the handle percentages are subdivided. It's not just one person. I mean, I think we had a specific.
Right, you have to include the parlays into it. I know
different,
but there's other factors.
No, that's true. So I would, if we talked about this for long enough, like if we spent 2 hours on this, we'd probably wind up agreeing at the end of the day on what the actual utility and how useful it is. My point is just that there's some, like it's not zero. And I think
I'd say there's zero.
Okay, so
I would say
take some convincing.
Back tested, Matt. I would say I would gather that if you back tested it, that's what you should be doing. If you whatever weight you want to put on that information, if you were to back test it over years or whatever, a large data set, I'm going to guess that you're going to end up close to about 50-50.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, I think.
So what does it matter?
If you bet, no, I think you'd be above 50, but still probably below the VIG. That's my guess.
Okay, so maybe it matters this much. I'm putting my, okay, if it matters that little, the point that I'm making is that if it matters that little and you can't beat the VIG, even if it did matter, and this is assuming that you get the information that I'm even talking about, not even the split currently, just the one where give me the roll of all the bets that ever came in. Now, of course, DK Sportsbook will never give that to you, but let's say you add all of that. Even then, it wouldn't, but even if, but the point that I was making before is that even if it did mean something, that not to put your employer down, not saying that it's a bad thing, they're a business. If it did mean something, they would adjust the line so it wouldn't mean anything before it did mean something. So even if it did mean something, how do you take advantage of it? And you can't.
Well, I think it's just that it doesn't mean very much. And it's not worth, like, there are more important things. But I also think that thinking about it in the negative is more useful. So like, if you look at that stuff and a bet that you really liked happens to align with what everyone's doing, maybe take a second and think about, okay, why is everyone doing this? Right? Like it could indicate that what you're doing,
you don't know that anyone's doing it. You don't have the numbers.
Well, the ticket numbers are easier to read. That's just raw.
But you don't have the numbers of the spread or the money line or what the number is.
Right. You don't. Yeah.
And what's everyone ever? If the line moved 3 points in the past 2 minutes, all that information you're showing me means nothing because I can't bet that number.
So it's case by case, right? Like if the line is moving back and forth, like we'll take Packers Saints week 1. The splits on that game almost entirely useless because Aaron Rodgers was out. And now he's in, and Michael Thomas was in, and now he's out, and the game was in New Orleans. Now it's not New Orleans, right? Like if you're looking at splits information there, it's like all the information has changed. So in that particular example, I probably agree with you, 0% utility in any sort of splits information there. But if you have another game where it's two teams where the line has been the same for 2 months leading up to week 1, none of the information's changed. It is what it is. And you have 78% of the tickets on one side, and the handle is like 78% on the other side. It at least gives you an indication that if you're betting where the 78% of tickets are, you maybe should be slightly concerned. That's
no, it doesn't. No, it does not. I will tell you, it means nothing. The line didn't move. It's an efficient line. The market would have moved the line. I mean, so it doesn't matter how many tickets or how much money. You're telling me that nothing's changed. The line's been -4 for 2 months, and it's leading up to you're betting on Sunday morning. And you're like, well, so how are the tickets? Well, they're the business, the traders at DraftKings. If they knew more of the money was coming here, and these are all sharp people, the line wouldn't be -4 anymore. It would have moved.
Maybe. Well, I think that's probably true in some cases. It's just that the lines are not necessarily intended to be perfectly efficient.
No, they're supposed to be efficient for the sharp bettors.
I think the goal of a line varies from game to game. So like when you have the Super Bowl, let's say, and the money is coming in everywhere, right? And there's all sorts of bets. Like the goal in the Super Bowl is to get the lines as accurate as absolutely possible so that you can just mitigate risk everywhere. But I think there are games where it's just like, and I don't know this to be the case for DraftKings traders. And we actually like have different traders.
Right, but you also have a different, right, because you have Camby and SB Tech.
So I'm not speaking from someone who's on the inside here. I'll just make that disclaimer.
Right.
But the goal of trading is not always let's make 50% on one side and 50% on the other.
I agree with that. Well, that's a misconception. Yes.
Yeah. So it's basically
but the goal, but Matt, your advantage. But Matt, the goal is to make the goal. I'm that may be controversial. I know what the goal is. The goal is to make the line efficient enough to prevent being taken advantage of while still getting action from people that don't realize they're being taken advantage of. That is the business goal. The goal is to make, and how else can you prevent a line? If the line is bad, people will take advantage of it. So the only way to prevent someone that knows the line is bad from taking advantage of it is either one, moving the line so it can't be, so you can't exploit it, or two, not allowing the players that know that it's a bad line to bet on it. So those are two ways that you make business. You make money in the sports betting business. They're doing one of the two. So if they're doing the second one, okay, Matt, for instance, they're saying that line has been -4, and what all the sharp players know, all the sharp bettors know that it should be -5, and they're just stopping them from betting because they're getting enough action that at -4 from people that don't realize it should be -5. That as long as we don't get taken advantage of, feel free to leave the bad line up. The bad line can stay up as long as it, and then you'd look at those splits and go, well, obviously there's enough people in the public that know that this line is off, that maybe at some point you're like, maybe I should be betting on that side. But the problem is you'll never know which lines are which and what. Right, you'll never know any information.
You don't know if you're in scenario 1 or scenario 2. And it's not the same for, even within one sports book, it's not the same for every game. Yeah, so basically what I'm saying is like scenario 2 could exist. There are games where it exists. I'm sure at every sports book in the world, and just
especially the smaller markets, Matt. Like in the like maybe in NFL sides and totals.
Yeah, it's
maybe
not going to be there.
Right, yeah. But college hockey in Ukraine or whatever lines. Yeah, probably not. Probably more for that.
Sure. So it's just like basically my my PSA is think about what scenario you're in, and don't use the splits and the handle percentages in a framework where they're not meant to be like, where they're not meant to give you an additional advantage. They're just meant to be interesting. Because when we put them out, like we're not, I can honestly say like, they're just going out there because people like them. And it's not with any ulterior motive. And because I've heard you say like, it's like putting numbers at the roulette table. I've never worked for a casino that does that, but I can bet that the reason they put those up is not because people like them. It's because it gets them to have a take.
No.
Maybe it's the same thing.
No, what used to happen before the electronic displays in casinos, people would cut, but casinos eventually gave out little markers, and you got to track the roulette wheel with little pencils and a little sheet. Obviously, it's much cheaper and much easier to show it on display. So they're doing it for the same reason that you are. That people
there's a demand for it, but I guess there's no possible value to that information in roulette. Unless you're just a superstitious person. But like, it can't possibly indicate anything in roulette because every spin is entirely independent, and the information of what, the only way that it could matter to know what people are betting on in roulette to get like the public for roulette is if the table's not, if it's slanted.
Right, if it's not aligned. But the problem comes in is that people, even without that display, people would trust me, people will come up to the roulette wheel and ask the dealer, said, has black been hit in the past hour? Right? I mean, but people are doing that because this is part of either they believe the superstition or they willfully, they know that it doesn't matter, but that's their version of entertainment. That's perfectly fine. But like, no, just with the splits, like no sharp sports bettor like is looking at that. I mean, if you want to look, if that's part of your entertainment, I mean, there's plenty of stuff in a horse racing. You get the daily racing form. Most of that information is garbage also, but it's what people want. What's the pace numbers? What does it matter? I mean, but if that's what they want to look at, and that what makes their experience, people like to have the facade of being smart more so than actually being smart. And that's not an insult to people, but if that's a form of entertainment for you, it's not a form of entertainment for me. I don't want to spend an hour to look at something to make me feel more comfortable with my bet, knowing that what I'm looking at like has no bearing on. I'll find it more fun just betting on a coin flip. Like I have no problem for horse racing. Like me and my friends on New Year's Day would always go to the Aqueduct or Belmont or whatever in New York. And one of them always got the daily racing form and would go on the bus ride or car ride, go through race one, race. They thought they knew horse racing. You know what I did? I rolled dice, right? Because like, to me, the entertainment is like, when I'm not here as a positive expectation. I'm not a professional horse bettor or anything like that. I know what most of the stuff in the daily racing form means, but am I going to be that? To me, that's not the fun part. It's like, why am I going through 2 hours of this thing that I know is not going to mean anything? I'm just hanging out with friends. I'm going to put a $10 bet down on whatever horse comes up on the dice. And whatever that payout is, it is. And more often than not, we went a whole bunch of years, 5, 6 years in a row. Like the amount of money that we all won and lost were about the same. But we had fun. Some people like looking through the racing forum to see if they could find, the Ouija board and the voodoo stuff. Fine. Some people, I could flip a coin and, I have to choose between two evenly priced players, evenly efficiently owned players in DFS, right? A lot of people are like, I'm going to go and look at the PFF grades. I'm going to go look at dude, I literally I've literally flipped a coin. I go to random.org, right? You go to random.org.
Random.org is a fun website. Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Because flipping a coin.
Right, and just press the number and whatever it is, it is.
Yeah.
Because that's not the fun part to me. I don't care. Whatever it is. I'm not going to do something that means nothing.
Yeah. No, it's fair. I think that's all really well said. And next time we talk, I'll probably have a better explanation as to why I think the way I do about all of that info.
Are they going to let you publish this now that I've said that the splits don't mean anything?
I think we'll be fine because it's just your opinion. I don't have to agree with you. You're just
right,
saying,
you don't have to. You're right. You don't have to.
And I don't. I think that they get taken way out of context, which is almost the same thing, but not exactly the same thing. But anyway, yeah, I think we've covered almost everything I wanted to cover. The only thing I wanted to ask you, just to the last thing going back to DFS, is that I think it's hard to pick. There's this issue with bankroll management, play the same every slate, and some people do that, and same with betting, right? Bet your consistent unit. But in reality, you want to bet more money when you think you have a greater advantage. So the question is, if you had a week, let's say hypothetically, where you could only play one slate and you had to get a top 1% finish, how would you go about determining which slate is the best, right? You have to skip 6 of the 7 days. Let's make it baseball to just make it a clear example for a week. What kind of baseball slate is the most appealing, where you think how big of a slate, what kind of setup is all the chalk on one team at Coors Field, or what would that slate look like if you could just say, I have one slate left and I have to get into the top 1% with one single lineup?
I mean, it really comes down to how inefficient the ownership is. So I just want to play on the slates with the most inefficient ownership.
But I guess what I'm asking is, where is that most likely to happen? 15-game slates, 5-game slates, 7, 8, where do you more often?
That's a trick. Okay. This is kind of a trick question.
Sure. I'm not thinking of it that way.
Right. Okay. But I know you're not thinking of it that way, but technically it has 2 answers. Because coming in the top 1% is different depending on what size field GPP it is. So the expected value of your lineup, maybe this is what it comes to. There's an expected value and then there's a standard deviation. So if you're telling me I need to get a top 1% finish, that I may not be playing the best lineup in those contests to win first place, but a lineup that could get a 1% finish, even if it doesn't have that much first place equity. Obviously, in DFS, you're playing for first place. So you'd never be.
Sure.
I would never.
If it makes it better, we'll make it the top 0.1%, where you have to be in the top 3 in the standings to make it a little more concrete.
Okay, I mean I would probably be playing a showdown slate.
Interesting. Okay.
Right.
Because my answer to that question is, I find that you can get the biggest edge when it's a 4 or 5 game slate, where there's a pitcher that everyone thinks is terrible, but actually it could be Jay Happ, it could be Mitch Keller, someone who actually probably projects well, at least in the bat, but probably other systems too. But the team he's facing is all really cheap. So everyone's stacking that team. And if your pitcher beats them, you're now so far ahead because there's negative correlation in the contest. And maybe on that same slate, you have the opposite, right? Where the chalk pitcher is not actually good. He's just underpriced. And the team he's facing is actually kind of decent and they have a lot of upside. So you get these, what I'm saying is, you want, on a smaller slate, do you feel like you can get more condensed negative correlation with what the field is doing?
Kind of, but I don't think you're thinking of it broadly enough. I don't think you're thinking of the concept broadly enough. If, let's say, let me give you an example, Matt. You're going to play 1,000, let's just call it 1,000 lineup contest, right? 1,000 entries. You could play one, right? It's single entry. It doesn't matter. It's just 1,000. There's going to be 1,000 lineups in this contest. On a 15-game slate versus a 3-game slate, how many different possible lineup combinations are there? Now, on a 15-game slate, there's billions upon billions. On a 3-game slate for baseball or whatever, there's much less. Now, the number one thing that destroys a lineup's expected value is it being duplicated. Okay, that's the number, that's before anything else. Now, on a 15-game slate, you don't really have to worry about duplication because there's billions of lineup combinations that it's very rare. Even two good players putting in 150 lineups are unlikely to be duplicated at all. Even if we're thinking the same way about a slate, going, I'm going to play a lot of this guy and that stack, we still may not ever be duplicated. On short slates and showdown, that's why I said showdown. If you're in a like NFL showdown or something, or MMA, small 9-fight MMA slate or something like that, very small amount of options. So much of the field is not prioritizing dupe factor. So what ends up happening is that in that 1,000 lineup contest, there may be 950 lineups that have at least one duplicate of it, which means all 950 lineups are now giving the EV of their lineups to the 50 that remain unique. So I'd rather play one of those 50 uniques, no matter what. If it was a 15-game slate and there were going to be 95% dupes, I'd want to play that slate also. Just the likelihood of people dupes.
So on the
people are going to play lineups that are too chalky on a small showdown or anything. So if I don't even have to worry about anything else other than being unique, to me, it's a high standard deviation because I'm probably not playing, a high projected lineup. Those lineups could win way more often than I do, but when they win, they have to split first place with 5 other people. But when I win first place, I don't. To me, that's the edge. That's why I play showdowns. That's why I play MMA, is because, especially in these large field GPPs, we're going to see a showdown to open the NFL season. 473,000 entries on DraftKings. You download the CSV afterwards, and you're going to find that 92% of the lineups have been duplicated. And some of those lineups have been duplicated hundreds, some thousands of times. And if you're going to play a lineup that's duplicated 3,200 times, you can't, when you win first place, it's supposed to be $1 million and you're going to get $900.
That's a good place to end on, actually. How many dupes for a lineup that you have? I know this will vary depending on which lineup it is, but how many are you comfortable with in a field of that size? So if you play a pretty well projecting lineup, maybe you run an optimizer and it's the 17th best lineup and it projects 4 points lower than the best one. And you open up the contest and 6 people have it besides you, but it's that big of a contest. Is that a win? Because it's
that's fun. That still could be plus EV. I mean, we're talking about an NFL showdown with $1 million to first place,
right?
And 473.
Doesn't have to be the only to be good lineup. It just
no. It could still be plus EV with that. Understand that as it gets duplicated more and more, your EV just starts getting destroyed, and it depends on it depends on the size. If I split first 10 ways and I get $100,000. I'm cool from a raw money perspective. I'm cool with that. I'm most likely not going to be, if I play 100 lineups in that showdown, it's quite likely I'm not going to play 100 uniques. I may only get 30 uniques and then 60 lineups that are under 10, and then maybe 10 lineups that I don't know, I screwed up in the 70s and 60s. I mean, you never know. So I'm not aiming to have all unique, but I want it to be unique enough that when it wins, if we played this slate over 10,000 times, that it'd still be a profitable return. So obviously the lower first place gets, the more flatter the top of the field is, the more likelihood you want to be unique, because when you do win solo, you win so much more money, and every single duplication you lose less and less. But if the raw money is worth it versus the amount of money that you put in, I think I could play a lineup in the $1 million showdown that's duplicated 10 times. And if I played this slate out 1 million times with that lineup, I still believe I'd be profitable. So I'm just pretty much trying to avoid the ones that are the most obviously way too duplicated.
Right. If you want to find a lineup that literally no one has, you might have to play a backup quarterback and hope for an injury in a contest that size. But yeah, if your goal is just to get it not duplicated very much, then yeah, that's certainly like that's the way to think about it for sure. All right, so we just did an hour and a half. This has been a good first episode. I'm not sure if it's going to be the first one because it's not out yet since we're recording this not live.
What is it going to be called? What's the episode going to be called?
That is still yet to be decided. Is some version of the DraftKings strategy betting and DFS pod. There will be a name in there. Don't worry.